Hi, I'm Maurice. 7 years after my mother's funeral, I walked into a room filled with family and felt like a stranger in my own story. My sister, the same one who stole the man I was going to marry, turned to smile, only to freeze when she saw the man standing beside me. My husband, the millionaire she thought she had won. But that wasn't the worst part. They erased me from family photos, sold the house meant for me, cut me out of my own mother's legacy. And when I finally spoke the truth, they called it drama. How do you forgive people who built their success on your silence? Would you stay quiet or speak up, knowing it could shatter everything? The sky was heavy that morning, not with rain, but with a thickness that settled into your lungs and refused to let go. I hadn't been back to Evanston in 7 years. The town hadn't changed much, but I had. I drove past the same corner bakery my mother used to take us to after Sunday service, past the elementary school where I once sat on the swings with my sister, dreaming of grown-up lives. Now, I was returning to honor the woman who had tried so hard to keep our family from fracturing and to face the very people who'd watched it splinter. The church stood still and somber, its brick facade softened by time. I parked 2 blocks away, needing the walk to gather myself. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the air was thick with floral arrangements and hushed condolences. I nodded at familiar faces, exchanged tight-lipped smiles with aunts and cousins who barely made eye contact. No one asked where I'd been. No one seemed surprised to see me back. Just polite nods, as if I were a forgotten bookmark placed back into a story they thought had ended. Then I saw her. Isolde entered like she owned the place, her arm looped through Thane's. My throat clenched. He looked older, thinner around the eyes, but still carried that infuriating air of confidence. And her, my sister, she looked polished, poised, like someone who had never stolen a thing in her life. They walked straight down the center aisle, and as if by design, Isolde settled into the front row seat, our mother's seat, the one reserved for me. She didn't even glance in my direction. I took a pew 3 rows back. My eyes stayed fixed on their hands, the way hers slid perfectly into his palm, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. And in a way, they had. Just not when I was looking. It was impossible not to be yanked back into that first funeral, our mother's. That's when I first saw them together. Not just standing side by side in shared grief, but holding hands behind the hearse, their fingers tangled in a kind of intimacy you don't fake. I'd stood frozen that day, heart thudding like a distant drum, my reality cracking without a single sound. I remember watching as Isolde tucked her head gently into his shoulder, pretending to cry. She never had to fake anything well. People always gave her the benefit of the doubt. And just like that, my fiancé, my future, became her comfort. I sat through the service in a fog. The priest spoke of healing, of letting go, of how Eleanor Wynne had been a light in her community and a compass for her family. I kept my face neutral, hands clasped tightly in my lap. Around me, the congregation nodded, sighed, dabbed at their eyes. When he called Isolde the rock that held the family through loss, I felt my stomach tighten. Aunt Geraldine leaned toward me after the eulogy and whispered, "Isolde really stepped up, didn't she? Always was Eleanor's strongest." Strongest. That word rang in my ears like a bell. When I looked up, Isolde was already glancing back at me. That same look she used to give me in high school when she borrowed my sweaters and returned them stained, calculated innocence. Then she smiled. It wasn't a grin, not even smug. Just a slight curve of the lips, subtle enough that only I would notice. And in that moment, I didn't feel sad. I felt insulted. The crowd slowly trickled out to the reception hall. I lingered behind, needing space, needing air. That's when I noticed it. Something catching the light as Isolde turned her head. I stepped closer, narrowing my eyes. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Dangling delicately from her left ear was a sapphire earring, my mother's, a pair she had promised me on my 30th birthday, saying, "They're not for value, they're for who you are." I had never received them. No one ever said what happened to them. I assumed they'd been lost or stored away. But there it was, in full display, swinging gently with Isolde's every confident turn. I looked down, throat burning, heart hammering. I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a message. And just like that, the past clawed its way into the present, one earring at a time. There was something about the way that earring caught the light that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just the sapphire. It was what it meant. My mother had promised them to me one late night over chamomile tea, years before she got sick. "Not for their worth," she'd said, touching my hand gently, "but for their story. You listen more than you speak, and you understand legacy." I never wore them, never had the chance. But there it was, swinging from Isolde's ear like a trophy, like something she'd earned. The reception after the memorial was held at our family home, though now people called it Isolde's place, without blinking. I stayed near the back patio, nursing a glass of watered-down lemonade, nodding absently at those who passed. The way people floated around Isolde was nauseating. Aunts complimented her strength. Cousins called her the glue. Even people who barely knew our family said things like, "Your mother would be proud of how you've held it all together." I wanted to scream. I wanted to hold up a sign that said, "She stole my life." But instead, I smiled. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. A family friend approached with a kind smile. "Isolde really stepped up, huh?" she said, not even asking how I'd been. "She's been the heart of this home since Eleanor passed." It was the way she said it, like I had vanished, like my absence was never questioned, just quietly accepted. I excused myself and slipped inside. The hallway smelled the same, a mix of lavender and floor wax, but the walls had changed. No more school portraits of me, no photos of me and Mom in the garden, no trace of the daughter who used to live there. Instead, framed canvases of Isolde's fundraising gala moments, her wedding with Thane, and candid shots of them hosting guests filled every visible wall. I hesitated outside what used to be my bedroom. Pushing the door open, I didn't know what to expect. But I didn't expect this. Pale pastel wallpaper, crochet pieces hung neatly on a pinboard, a reading nook with floral cushions. My room had become a craft lounge for strangers. No trace of me. Nothing that even hinted I once laid awake on that bed, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of a life with Thane. I walked in slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, or what used to be one. Now it was a bench lined with books on meditation, sewing, and healing through gratitude. My reflection in the mirror stopped me cold. I looked like a guest in someone else's childhood. I left the room before the burn in my chest turned into something visible. The kitchen was empty, dim with the soft hum of the refrigerator. But voices floated in from the hall, sharp and too careless to be quiet. "She probably thinks this is still her home," Isolde whispered. Thane chuckled, low, dismissive. "It's not like she has anywhere else to be." They weren't cruel words, not on the surface. But I knew the tone. I knew the game. Make the target sound ridiculous enough, and no one will question how you push them out. I stood still, breathing through my nose, letting the ache settle. Then I reached for my coat hanging near the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked out, past the porch swing Mom used to sit on with her crossword puzzle, past the rosebush she planted the year I turned 16. No one stopped me. No one noticed. And I realized I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because I was done watching them rewrite my story. The guest house I'd rented sat 2 blocks from the house I used to call home. It was tucked behind a weather-worn duplex, with a porch that leaned slightly forward, like it was always listening. The place was quiet, no sounds, but the occasional bark from a neighbor's dog, and the wind brushing through half-dead trees. I hadn't unpacked everything. just the essentials: a carry-on, a small jewelry box, and a photo album I hadn't touched in years. That evening, I sat cross-legged on the faded armchair, the photo album resting on my thighs. I opened it carefully, like it might bite. There we were, me, Isolde, and Mom. I was 15, awkward smile, arms folded tightly over a cardigan. Isolde had her usual radiance, chin lifted, confident. And Mom, her eyes were always tired but warm. I remembered that day, some cousin's birthday party, a rented pavilion at Lakeview Park. The kind of memory most people wouldn't recall unless they'd spent decades trying to forget the sound of their own silence. I was halfway through flipping pages when the knock came. Not loud, not insistent, just expectant. I opened the door to find Aunt Loretta, Dad's cousin, technically, standing on the porch with a manila envelope clutched to her chest like it held a confession. "Can I come in for a moment?" she asked, eyes darting around like she was worried someone had followed her. We sat at the small kitchen table. She didn't ask how I'd been or why I hadn't stayed at the reception. She placed the envelope in front of me, then pulled her hand back like it burned. "Your mother asked me to give this to you, if the time ever felt right. I think that time is now." My fingers hovered above the seal for a beat. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter, my mother's handwriting unmistakable, with those curling L's and wide spacing she'd picked up from her years as a teacher. The paper smelled faintly like the cedar box she used to keep her jewelry in. "Maris, if you're reading this, then things didn't go the way I hoped. I always meant to tell you myself, but I feared time wouldn't let me. The house was meant for you, not because Isolde didn't love it, but because you understood what it held. Every crack in the kitchen tiles, every squeaky step on the back staircase. You remembered." I told the lawyer. I left the note. "But if this falls into your hands, then something didn't go as planned. Please don't fight over walls and windows. But please don't forget what was meant to be yours. Love, Mom." I didn't cry right away. It wasn't the shock, it was the confirmation. I had always known. In every way that mattered, I'd felt myself being pushed out. Of the house, of the family photos, of the narrative. They weren't accidents, they were edits. And Isolde had always been good at redlining stories, until she was the only one left in them. I folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. My hands shook, not with fear, but with clarity. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't overreacting. I was remembering correctly. Outside, the sky had turned a soft orange. I grabbed my coat and the letter and walked slowly toward the house. Not to confront anyone. Not yet. I passed the rose bushes, now overgrown, and stepped into the backyard. The old oak tree still stood tall, its bark split in the same way it had been when I carved my initials into it with a hairpin at 13. That day, Mom had caught me and just smiled. "The truth always finds its way back," she'd said, "even if someone tries to bury it." I sat beneath the tree for a while, letting the chill settle around me. Then I took out my phone and photographed the letter, front and back. I wasn't ready to make moves, but I was done pretending nothing happened. I opened my contacts, scrolled past the names I didn't need, and tapped the one that mattered. R. Asher. The line rang once, twice. A voice answered, low and steady. "I think it's time we met in person," I said. I met Rowan at a little cafe tucked behind the library downtown, one of those places where the staff knew your name but never asked questions. He was already there when I arrived, seated by the window, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. He stood when he saw me, offered a soft smile. There was no small talk, just a long look between us, quiet and familiar. I sat down and placed the letter from my mother between us. He read it once, then again slower, tracing the edges of the paper like it was evidence in a case he'd already guessed the outcome of. I didn't speak. I just let the silence hold the truth longer than I ever had. Rowan leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "You know this letter doesn't just clarify things," he said. "It changes them." I nodded. but I'm not looking to fight for a house. I want acknowledgement. I want it said out loud." He didn't argue, just reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folder. Inside were printouts, property transfers, mortgage details, and bank alerts connected to Isolde and Thane. The paper trail wasn't just questionable, it was intentional. "She refinanced the house less than a year after your mother passed," Rowan said, "under her name only." "She didn't wait long," I murmured, but I wasn't shocked. Disappointed, sure, but not surprised. We talked for another hour. Not about revenge, just timing. Rowan was calm, rational. "Sometimes," he said, "dropping the truth too early only gives people time to twist it." I understood, but I was done waiting. 2 days later, I invited Isolde to brunch. Neutral ground. A sunlit bistro near the lake with overpriced omelets and just enough background noise to muffle a storm if one broke out. She arrived 10 minutes late, of course, dressed like she was headed to a board meeting, all navy silk and rehearsed poise. She kissed my cheek like we hadn't spent years dodging each other's names in conversations. We ordered. Small talk barely lasted through the drinks, and then I said evenly, "I wanted to ask you about the title transfer on Mom's house." She didn't blink, just tilted her head. "What about it?" "I came across some documents, bank alerts, the refinance, the ownership shift." I kept my tone neutral. She gave a soft laugh, the kind people use when they want you to feel stupid. Still trying to claim a life that wasn't yours to begin with? There it was. I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not claiming anything. I'm stating facts and giving you one opportunity to acknowledge what you did." She sipped her mimosa, eyes locked on mine. "And if I don't?" I reached into my bag and slid a photo across the table. It was from 10 years ago, Christmas morning, all of us on the couch, Mom, Dad, Isolde, Thane, and me. Except in this version, I was gone. Literally, my figure had been cut clean out, the space blurred by someone's shaky hands and a printer set to hide shame. Isolde's fingers twitched when she saw it. Her smirk faltered for half a second, then returned, tighter this time. "That's dramatic." I didn't respond right away. I waited for her to fill the space. When she didn't, I stood. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to reclaim my name. You don't have to say a word, but I promise you, this doesn't stay between us." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "No one's going to believe you over me." I paused, looked back just once. Maybe, but they're going to hear me anyway. I stepped into the sunlight, let the door close behind me, and walked toward whatever came next. I had offered her one last chance to act with decency, and she chose denial. Morning came slow, pale light creeping in through the thin curtains of the guest house, like it was afraid to disturb me. I was already awake, sitting at the tiny dining table with the letter, a stack of printed records, and a faded photo Mom had framed before her last birthday. She was in the middle, Isolde to one side, me on the other, though you wouldn't know it from how the copy hanging in the family hallway looked now. In that version, it was just the two of them. I stared at my mother's handwriting, reading her words for what had to be the 20th time. Don't forget what was meant to be yours. She hadn't meant it as fuel for war, but as a reminder not to disappear. She knew Isolde would rewrite history. She just didn't know how far it would go. I wasn't there to patch things, not anymore. I was there to remind them that my silence wasn't permission. Later that morning, I stepped out for coffee, needing to breathe air that wasn't wrapped in old wallpaper, and the smell of unresolved grief. The cafe around the corner had just opened. As I waited for my drink, I heard a familiar laugh. Vanessa, Isolde's ever-loyal friend, stood in line behind me, scrolling through her phone, oblivious. When she saw me, her smile flickered before settling into polite. "Mary's," she said, like she wasn't sure she should be happy to see me. We exchanged pleasantries, fake, short. She mentioned the memorial, the beautiful flowers, how hard it must be for you both. Then she said something that stopped me. Did you see the new kitchen? Isolde said the renovation cost a fortune. Private loan, I think. But worth it. She really made the house her own. I kept my expression still. Just nodded. Right. She went on. You should be proud, though. Keeping it in the family. Eleanor would have wanted that. Proud? For what? Being erased professionally, emotionally, financially? I left with my coffee and walked back without tasting a sip. Inside, I pulled up my laptop and opened the files Rowan had shown me how to access. Public property databases, tax filings, loan statements. It was all there. Isolde had refinanced the home under the guise of being sole heir. The house my mother said was mine, legally converted under false pretenses. I dug deeper, my hands steady now, my mind clearer than it had been in years. The open letter I started wasn't angry. It wasn't even defensive. It was a declaration. A written account of how a narrative can be hijacked when the right people stay quiet. Then I stumbled on something unexpected. A buried email from Isolde, sent to my old inbox, the one I barely checked anymore. The subject line, in case it matters someday. The message was vague, all platitudes and passive voice. I'm sorry if things felt unfair. I know emotions can get complicated in times of grief. I never intended to cause you pain. No acknowledgement of the lies, the manipulation, just the kind of message someone writes to cover themselves if they're ever called out. I didn't bother replying. Instead, I printed the email, tucked it in the same folder as the refinance papers and the letter from Mom. Then I left. I drove past the bakery, turned left at the school, and pulled into the parking lot of the community center, the one where Mom had run local history workshops for decades. Inside, nothing looked different. Same flyers on the wall, same bulletin board honoring legacy donors. Except now, the photo next to Eleanor's name showed Isolde at a podium, arms raised like a politician. There was no mention of me. My name, which had been listed on the founding committee of that program, was gone. I stood in front of the board a long time. People walked by without noticing, but I noticed. Every small omission, every quiet removal. On my way out, I stopped at the church a few blocks away. Father Reese wasn't in, but the secretary recognized me. I just need to leave this, I said, placing a sealed envelope in her hands. What's in it? She asked. Something my mother wrote, I said, in case history tries to rewrite itself again. She nodded, didn't ask more. As I walked back to my car, the wind picked up, pushing against me like it wanted me to turn around. But I didn't. The next time I saw Isolde, I wasn't the one holding back. It was a Sunday. The kind that carried no wind, no scent, just stillness. I parked across the street from the house I once memorized like a map. It looked the same in shape, but not in spirit. The garden was manicured into something symmetrical and sterile. Mom's hydrangeas were gone. The piano was missing too. I'd find that out soon enough. In its place, a sleek liquor cabinet now stood. Nothing said legacy like replacing Beethoven with bourbon. The invitation called it an Eleanor Memorial Tea, which made me laugh when I read it. My mother hated pretense. She would have rolled her eyes at cucumber sandwiches and forced smiles. But Isolde was always good at branding loss. Inside, voices buzzed. Laughter floated under chandeliers that hadn't seen dust since the cleaning service started weekly visits. I walked through the foyer, noticing that every picture frame was perfectly aligned. Every family photo had been retouched or recropped. I no longer existed in the hallway, where I once practiced piano scales, barefoot and bored. Isolde stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of sparkling water as if she'd invented stillness. She wore a dress the color of ivory judgment and a necklace too bold for the occasion. When she saw me, her smile tightened. We exchanged no words. The guests mingled until she tapped her glass and began her speech. Thank you all for coming to honor my mother's memory. This house, her house, was a place of warmth, of tradition, and of strength. And I've done my best to protect that legacy, even when others chose distance. There it was. I didn't flinch, but the air shifted. A couple of people looked at me briefly before returning to their plates. Thane stood behind her, arms crossed like a hired bodyguard. Rowan, across the room, leaned against the wall. He didn't move, but his jaw tightened. Isolde continued, weaving herself into my mother's history with surgical precision, stitching her image into every corner where I used to live. After she finished, I walked to the coffee table and placed a small frame down. People leaned in. It was a donor plaque, one that had once hung in the local museum where my mother had curated exhibits for over a decade. It now listed Isolde as the lead archivist. I said only one thing. Some legacies rewrite themselves, but not everyone forgets the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I didn't need to. The silence afterward said more than I ever could. I turned to leave. Running again? Isolde called from behind me. Too loud, too late. I paused, then turned halfway. No, I said. This time, I'm removing myself before you can erase me again. And I kept walking. Rowan was already outside. We didn't say anything for a few steps. The sun had begun to dip, casting everything in gold that didn't feel warm. As we passed by my Uncle Gerald, he didn't stop me, just nodded once. Behind him, Aunt Loretta blinked twice and mouthed something I didn't bother deciphering. No one reached out to stop me, but their eyes followed. And for once, they weren't filled with pity. They were watching something they hadn't seen before. Me, not broken, not apologetic, just done pretending. That was the last time I played by her rules, because the next move would be mine. The suite at the hotel was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the soft tap of keys under Rowan's fingers. I sat across from him, reviewing the documents spread across the table like cards in a game we were no longer pretending we didn't know how to play. Title records, mortgage refinancing, loan statements, screenshots of Isolde's name on things that used to belong to my mother. To me. Rowan looked up, expression unreadable. You're sure you want to do this? I'm done watching her rewrite the narrative like I was never there, I said. He leaned back slightly, folded his hands together. I should have told you sooner. I knew of her, years ago, through business. There was talk, nothing you could prove in a courtroom, but enough to know the patterns. You didn't say anything. You needed to come to it on your own, he said. You're not someone who follows someone else's fight. That was true. The next morning, we walked into the conference together, quietly. I wasn't listed as a speaker or a guest, just another attendee in muted clothing with a notebook and a plan. Isolde, of course, was front and center. The event was hosted by a regional women in business organization, and she'd been invited as a panelist. Her bio in the program described her as a community leader and legacy builder, which nearly made me laugh out loud. I sat near the back of the room while Rowan positioned himself closer to the side exit. We didn't need to speak. We had both already rehearsed the moment in silence. The panel began. Isolde sat between a retired judge and a tech startup founder, smiling with practiced warmth. When it was her turn to speak, she dove in with ease, spinning her version of our family's past like she was reading from a script. Loss can destroy a family, she said, voice steady, but those of us who remain must lead with grace. There was a pause. Murmurs of agreement. Then came the audience Q&A. I stood. My question is for Mrs. Varelli, I said. Her head turned slowly. You speak a lot about legacy. I'm curious. How do you define legacy when the truth has been altered? She didn't blink. I'm sorry, and you are? I smiled. Maris Wynne, and this is my husband, Rowan Asher. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, but distinct. People turned. Isolde's jaw locked for half a second. Rowan stood up, nodded once. Pleasure. Isolde recovered quickly, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The moderator moved the session along, awkwardly. But the tension didn't fade. It simmered. Outside, as the crowd dispersed, Isolde found me near the parking lot. You ambushed me, she hissed, barely moving her lips. No, I said. I introduced myself. You've been pretending I disappeared. I thought I'd reintroduce myself. Rowan approached, calm as ever. We've actually met, he said, extending his hand. Years ago. In a less flattering context. You may not remember. She didn't take his hand, just stared. I know Thane too, he added. That's a different story. Isolde's shoulders stiffened. What are you trying to do, Maris? Nothing underhanded, I said. Just stepping out of the shadows you've cast. She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. We left her standing there. Later that evening, I stopped by the hotel front desk and asked the concierge to hold an envelope for a guest checking out the next morning. Inside was a printed program from the event. My name and Rowan's circled in ink. Isolde's name? Not even listed next to the keynote. She'd played the game thinking I'd never learn the rules. That moment didn't just shake her. It shifted everything she thought she controlled. The invitation came by email, polite, last minute, and almost apologetic. A speaker had dropped out of a non-profit event focused on legacy and reinvention, and they wondered if Rowan and I might consider filling the slot together. I read it 3 times before showing it to him. The same community center? I asked. He nodded. The one where your mom ran Saturday art programs. And Isolde's a sponsor? Rowan raised a brow. She helped fund the renovations. I didn't hesitate. We're going. We spent the evening preparing, but not rehearsing. I wasn't writing a speech. I was telling a story. My mother's story. My own. The morning of the event, the center buzzed with volunteers and floral centerpieces. The guest list included local business leaders, former students of my mother's, board members from the museum, and, naturally, press. Isolde arrived 20 minutes late, pausing at the entrance just long enough to register our names on the event program. She didn't make a scene. That wasn't her style. But I saw her face freeze for a half second when she realized Rowan and I were seated at the head table. The host welcomed everyone, listed out credentials, and years of community service, all of which conveniently omitted the history behind those positions. Then we were called to speak. Rowan opened with a brief anecdote about failing his first business and learning to rebuild. When it was my turn, I stood without notes. Legacy, I began, is not just what we build, but what we leave behind in the stories others tell about us. I let the silence settle. For some, legacy is controlled through headlines, plaques, and donor walls. But real legacy shows up in who remembers you when no one's watching. I spoke of families, how silence is a language, how sometimes the loudest lies are told in photographs with people cropped out. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. Everyone in the room had heard whispers. I gave them a voice. There are homes filled with memories that have been reassigned through manipulation, not law, not love. And yet, the walls remember. The floorboards creak in a rhythm only the rightful hear. At the end, I pulled out a frame and held it up. This is the last full photo of my mother, my sister, and me, before one of us was removed, not by death, but by revision. Gasps were audible. And this, I continued, placing a second frame beside it, is a letter my mother wrote, her wishes, her words, not edited, not redacted. I stepped back. Rowan met my gaze from the side of the stage. The room didn't move for a full minute. Isolde stared at her lap. Afterward, people approached, not in a rush, but slowly, carefully. A retired school librarian patted my arm and said, "Your mother would have been proud." A former museum colleague leaned in close, whispering, "We all wondered why your name vanished." A board member from the garden committee handed me a card and said, "We'd like you to come back and advise us." I nodded. I didn't cry. Isolde left without speaking, slipped out through a side exit like someone leaving a party that had become about someone else. As we stepped into the parking lot, Rowan murmured, "She thought silence was her shield." I looked up at the sky. It was the same shade of blue my mother wore on Sundays. "No," I said. Silence just gave me time to choose my words. The sun was fading, but I didn't feel dimmed. For the first time in years, I walked forward carrying only my name, and it didn't weigh me down at all. The silence wasn't broken by a scream, but by the truth, finally allowed to speak. I woke up to a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. 12 messages, then 23, then calls. Some names I hadn't seen in years. Old classmates, former colleagues of Mom's, even one of my college professors. Most said the same thing. "Thank you." A few said I had no idea. And a handful admitted what I'd always suspected, that they knew something was wrong, but didn't know how to say it. The one that stopped me cold came from Claudia, a name I hadn't thought of in a decade. She used to be close with Isolde, maid of honor close. Her message was short. "I always thought something didn't add up. She told me once, back when you left, that she was in therapy for control issues. I didn't think much of it then. But now, I'm sorry, I see it." I stared at those last 3 words. I see it. There was something about being seen, not just acknowledged, but fully understood, that hit deeper than any headline. Later that afternoon, I drove to the community center. The event had passed, but I felt like I had left a part of myself there, like some ghost version of me had lingered after the applause died. Inside, the place looked the same. The sunlight hit the same angles. The bulletin board was still crowded with flyers, and the front desk had a bowl of peppermints, like always. But one thing had changed. The legacy wall, the display honoring major donors and board members, had a blank space where Isolde's name used to be. It wasn't defaced. It wasn't covered. It was simply gone. A staff member I barely remembered from years ago nodded toward it. "We had a few complaints, and then someone mailed in a letter, from your mom. Real one, not the one we were told about." She looked at me, carefully. "Sometimes truth comes in late, but it still arrives." I left without taking a mint. Back in the car, I sat in silence. Not the kind that felt heavy, but the kind that made room. Over the next few days, the ripple turned into quiet shifts. I heard through a mutual contact that Isolde had canceled her Boston speaking engagement. No public statement, no excuse. Just vanished from the program. Thane? Apparently, he was focusing on private matters. Translation: damage control. Mutual friends began to go quiet. The ones who used to repost Isolde's quotes and gala pics were now posting throwbacks with vague captions about time revealing everything. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I passed by the old oak tree again that week. This time, not on a mission. Just walking. The branches still reached wide, like arms stretched in welcome. I used to feel like that tree knew more than any of us, that it had seen the lies bloom before we did. I stood there a long while. Then I sat beneath it, opened my journal, and wrote just one line. "Truth doesn't punish. It clears the air so you can breathe." That night, I slept through the entire night without waking up once. The family never said a word, but silence, when it shifts, is its own kind of earthquake. The front steps still creaked. Even after everything had changed, after the name on the deed had been rewritten, after the walls had heard whispers they were never meant to hear, those steps remained. Familiar. Dependable. Just like the old key now in my hand, smooth-edged from decades of use. Only this time, the door it unlocked had been bought back. Not stolen, not inherited. Returned. Rowan never told me until the papers were signed. He'd waited until everything was secure, the transfer from the bank finalized. "It's yours," he'd said simply, handing me a small box with the key inside. No strings, just what should have always been. That morning, I came alone. The house was quiet, as if holding its breath. I moved room to room without turning on the lights, letting the sun do the work. The living room still had the dent in the carpet where Mom's recliner used to sit. The hallway smelled like cedar and lemon oil, but the attic, That was what I came for. I found the boxes in the far back corner, labeled in her handwriting, holiday, recipes, photos, Maris. She had saved them, everything. Birthday cards I'd made at age 5. My high school graduation photo, creased but unthrown. A music box that no longer worked, but still opened with the same soft resistance. I didn't take anything with me just yet. I wanted to feel it first. Downstairs, I placed an envelope on the dining table. Not sealed with drama. Just sitting quietly, waiting. Inside was a copy of my mother's letter, the one she'd written to me about the house, and a note of my own. I'm not here to shame you. I'm here to stop hiding. Beneath it, a flash drive. On it, an audio file. My mother's voice, recorded weeks before she passed, her tone clear despite the wear in it. I want this house to go to Maris, not because she's better, but because she remembers, she listens. I didn't wait for Isolde to find it. That wasn't the point. 2 weeks later, I attended the quarterly board meeting at the community center. I sat in the back. No fanfare. No need to speak. Isolde wasn't there. When the chairwoman stood to announce the reinstatement of the Eleanor Wynne Community Garden under new trusteeship, she didn't look at me. She didn't need to. My name was in the minutes. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. Afterward, a few attendees nodded my way. One woman placed a hand on my shoulder in the hallway and simply said, "We were wrong. Thank you for correcting it." That evening, I walked back through the front door of the house with a sense of stillness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't unpack much, just my laptop, a framed photo of Mom, and a brass plaque I'd brought from storage. Truth held gently can still be powerful. It sat perfectly on the edge of the desk I'd placed in the back room, the one I was turning into a space for women seeking legal help through transitions, divorces, custody battles, quiet wars behind closed doors. This wasn't about fixing what had been broken. It was about building something new. I opened my laptop. The grant proposal was halfway written. I'd finish it tonight. The house had changed hands, but the story? I finally held the pen. The envelope was small. No return address. No handwriting I recognized. But when I opened it, the paper inside was unmistakably hers. Stationery with tiny gold corners and the slight indentation of someone who writes with too much pressure. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. What got lost between us, it began, was never about things. It was always the space we let grow and never tried to close. I found the USB. I listened. No defense. No excuse. No signature. Just that last sentence. I listened. I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand, but because something about it didn't hurt the way I thought it might. The absence of justification felt like the first honest thing she'd given me in years. A week later, I walked to the community garden. The same garden Mom used to weed with gloved hands and a radio clipped to her belt. It had changed since then. New signage, new benches. But the plaque at the entrance still bore her name. "Speak only when the silence starts to hurt." That was Mom's line. Not one of her famous sayings. Just something she whispered to me once when I was too afraid to speak up in a school meeting. I never forgot it. I rounded the corner of the garden beds, and there she was. Isolde. No makeup. No designer sunglasses. Just jeans, a cardigan, and her hair pulled back like we were 17 again, helping Mom haul mulch. She looked up when she saw me. Didn't flinch, just nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said softly, still kneeling next to a rosemary plant. "I didn't think you'd want to." "I didn't come for you," I replied, sitting down on the nearby bench. "I came because Mom would have." She sat beside me minutes later. Neither of us said anything. The wind did most of the talking, rattling the leaves, brushing past our shoulders. After what felt like a lifetime of silence between us, it was a strange comfort. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she finally said. "I just wanted you to know." I'm not hiding behind being the chosen one anymore. I'm not sure I ever really wanted it. I looked straight ahead, watching a child tug at a dandelion near the fence. You were never the villain, I said. You were just the distraction from everything we didn't want to face about each other. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just sat there, breathing in the air like someone who'd been holding their breath too long. I think I hated you more for pretending it didn't matter, I continued, more than for what you took. I know, she whispered. We stayed like that for a while. Quiet, unarmed, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches, just space, finally being acknowledged instead of filled with the wrong things. Before I stood to leave, I remembered my mother's voice from that old recording on the USB. Let them find their own peace, even if it doesn't look like yours. So, I didn't make promises. I didn't say we'd talk soon or get coffee next week. She stood with me and asked, Will I see you again? I paused. I don't know, but I don't hate you anymore. I walked away without looking back, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't need to see her reaction to know what she heard. Forgiveness wasn't a door I opened, but a weight I stopped carrying. There was something different about the way the floor sounded under my steps. The creak in the hallway no longer felt like a whisper from the past. It felt like a familiar voice saying, You're home! The walls weren't watching me anymore. They were waiting. The house was fully mine now, not just in paperwork, but in rhythm. I no longer paused before turning doorknobs or crossing thresholds. I no longer wondered if I had the right to open drawers. I converted Mom's old bedroom into a reading space for neighborhood girls. Shelves lined the walls, donated books filled the gaps, and a few beanbag chairs sat in the corner. The only thing left untouched was her window seat, which still caught the light perfectly at 4 p.m., just as she used to say. While moving some boxes under the stairs, I found one final relic, a leather-bound journal with her initials etched into the corner. I flipped it open and realized it wasn't notes or grocery lists. It was a collection of her prayers. Each one dated, each one addressed to no one in particular. Let them be sisters again, one day in silence or in speech. It didn't break me. It steadied me. Later that week, Rowan knelt in the backyard, digging a small hole near the edge of the garden. I watched from the porch before walking down to join him. What are you planting? I asked. He wiped sweat from his forehead. Plum tree. I tilted my head. Why here? Because it's where your story rooted itself again. I didn't respond. I just picked up a second shovel and helped him press the soil around the base. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Behind us, through the open back door, I could hear soft laughter. 2 women from my legal aid group had dropped by early for their appointment and were catching up in the kitchen. That sound filled more than the house. It filled the space that used to ache. A few days later, while sorting paperwork in the office I'd built off the den, there was a knock at the door. Not urgent, just hopeful. I opened it to find a girl, maybe 16, holding a folder to her chest, like it might blow away in the breeze. My aunt said you helped her, she said quickly. I want to go to college, but I don't know where to start. I stepped aside. Start here. She walked in slowly, eyes scanning the room. On the wall behind my desk, thank you notes were pinned like tiny victories. Handwritten cards, doodles from kids, even a note from a woman who'd just gotten full custody of her son. I added another pushpin to the board that day. That night, after the house had quieted and the dishes were done, Rowan and I sat across from each other in the kitchen. No fancy anniversary dinner. Just toast, fruit, and 2 mugs of Earl Grey. To all the things we grew, he said, raising his cup, that no one could dig up again. I clinked mine against his. And to the ones we never let die. After he went to bed, I stayed behind to write in my journal. I didn't write about revenge or pain or even forgiveness. I wrote, I never reclaimed what was stolen. I just chose what to keep. That was enough. And maybe that's the real inheritance, not what's passed down, but what we choose to build from the pieces. Maybe the greatest lesson I've learned through all of this is that healing doesn't always come with closure, and justice doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits across from you, and lets you breathe again. I spent years waiting for an apology, a reckoning, a moment where someone would say, "You were right." But what I truly needed was something far simpler: to stop needing it. I reclaimed my peace the moment I stopped performing pain for others and started building something I believed in. If there's one thing I'd pass on to anyone listening, it's this: your voice is never gone, even if others have tried to erase it. It waits for you, and when you're ready, it will speak with more power than you ever imagined. I'm curious, what did this story bring up for you? Have you ever felt erased, forgotten, or rewritten in your own life? Let me know in the comments. If this story touched your heart, comment 1, or tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't, that's okay too. I'd love to hear why, and what your story looks like. If this video found its way to you and you want to hear more stories of resilience, quiet courage, and the kind of endings life doesn't always write for us, hit that subscribe button and join me for the next chapter. We're not done telling the truth, and I hope you're not done listening.